It's over by the south shed. I'll get that for you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, it sure is a lovely morning.
Yeah, how was your drive?
Oh, it wasn't too bad. You know, a bit bumpy. Other than that, nothing too much to worry about. Anyway, it shouldn't take too long.
No, that's good.
So this is your machine, is it?
This is it. The horse is saying that they could come to my business, so come give it a kick.
Yeah, I can understand that.
It's good of you to come on such short notice. They've had a breakdown at the sawmill. Told us they could use it right away. As soon as you give it your approval, they're ready to move it up to the bush.
Why don't you give me a ladder and I'll climb up and take a look?
Sure.
Yeah, thanks. Here you go. Great. Just get these coveralls and we'll be all set. Oh, that sounds all right. Let's go up and have a look. Main shut-off's pretty good, too. Let's take a look at the governor. Gee, that moves really well. So it was last inspected in 26, and you haven't fired it up since then?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, let's get down and check the firebox. Ah, it looks pretty good. There's very little rust in here. Yeah, there's a lot of years left in this machine. Oh, I have no problem passing this boiler. You have a place we can go so I can complete the certificate?
Come on up to the house. You can fill out your forms there. Mom, this is Mr. Hayes, the government boiler inspector. Looks like the boiler passed.
Nice to meet you, Mr. Hayes. Francis, leave those and take Mr. Hayes' coat. Well, I guess that means the boiler will finally be leaving. Good. Bob, why don't you and Mr. Hayes wash up and I'll make you some tea.
nervous about these letters.
Why is that?
Well, something that happened to a girl. Blew up, killed 4 people.
Really? Whereabouts is that?
You know that place called Castleavery. Mom? Mr. Hayes has been asking about the explosion.
Yes, I understand that you've never been very pleased about having that steam engine here on the farm.
If I'd had my way, it never would have been brought here. Bob knows that.
Mom, these modern ones are much safer. People around here are still nervous about steam boilers. But I think we'll be glad to see this one go.
Do you know what happened, Mr. Hayes?
Well, I've heard some, but nobody seems to know much. Do you?
I would say so. It happened on my father's farm, just a mile south of here.
Right.
I was married and living here by then, so thank heavens I wasn't a witness. It ruined my father's life. We must have discussed every detail 100 times in this very room. Francis, please bring us the tea and some biscuits. And I'm sure Mr. Hayes would like some raspberry jam.
Oh, yes, please.
The Mounties were supposed to inspect the boilers back then.
Thank you.
Some say if they'd have done that one, it never would have happened.
Oh, this tea looks great.
It was a terrible thing. Look at these newspaper cuttings.
In those days, they had to take shortcuts, make do with what they had. Nobody really knows what went wrong.
I can tell you what went wrong. It may be many years ago, but it's not something you just forget. It was the first year of the great drought, but our crops were still quite good. Dad had planted 8 more acres for Jim and Betty. My brother Jim. Betty had just joined him that spring. Back in the 80s, almost all of the harvest work was done with horses and by hand. I suppose we could have done it the same old way, but as soon as the train reached us, the heavy steam equipment began arriving from the east. The McLennans were the first to use steam around here. That fall, Dad got talking to Joe Duggan Sr. He had his family settled by the river at Castleavery. They decided to see if they could get the McLennans to bring the threshing outfit up here to do the 3 farms. Joe Duggan Jr. went down to Mississippi to see if he could work a deal.
Is there a Mr. McLennan here?
I'm James McLennan. This is my cousin John.
Pleased to meet you, Mr. McLennan. I'm Joe Duggan from Castleavery, and I've been sent over by my father to purchase your thrashing services. There are 3 farms interested if you can get your thrashing outfit across the river.
Well, it'll be a good 2 weeks before the crops are ready around here, and most of them look pretty poor. How do yours look?
Oh, ours are just fine. Our stacks are ready for threshing, and the other farms will be ready in a few days' time. How soon do you think you'll be able to come?
Well, I've been waiting for a new spring for the pressure gauge. It should be in Russell on Saturday's train. I believe I could waste the whole season waiting for parts.
Well, William Anderson is 4 miles south of us, and he wants his done. And his son-in-law, Bob Albright, is a mile south of that. And he's got his cut and in stooks, and it'll be hauled to stacks by the time your outfit arrives. William Anderson's won't be in stacks by that time. Would that be a problem?
As long as there are a couple of teams with drivers, it's just as easy to haul it from the fields and thresh it. Between you and Mr. Anderson, there should be enough teams.
I'll be there with Mr. Fullerton and my brother Francis. Would that be help enough?
That'll be fine. We'll leave here after breakfast on Wednesday and meet you at the ford.
Good. We'll be there.
Well, fine. Have you had much frost up where you are lately?
Not too much. The harvest seems yet.
It turned cold right after they made the deal. We were loading our stooks in the snow. It was an early snow and it didn't stay around, but when that happens, it's just one more thing to make you want to get the work out of the way. I guess the cold weather got the outfitters edgy too. It took them twice as long as they expected to finish the Dugan farm. They worked in the dark, tearing down the outfit so they could be ready to move to Dad's the next morning.
You always have to have problems when there's no time to spare. We should have been set up at the Andersons. Instead, we're just sitting around here.
I think they should have scrapped that boiler back in Bruce County. It's no wonder they sold it to us. James, I don't think I can stand another day of that safety valve. This morning I was ready to pelt it with my iron to make it quit hissing. Isn't there something we can do about it?
No, you'll just have to plug your ears. That valve never has closed fully. The seal barely comes within a quarter inch of the closure. I wish that was the only problem. Who would have expected a leak?
You should have seen your face when you saw the water below the boiler. You looked fit to push the whole outfit down the valley.
And those soft plugs are supposed to melt out, not crumble out.
Well, I still say you're lucky you didn't burn yourself crawling into that boiler. It was still pretty hot.
Well, better to waste a half a day than a whole day. And it won't leak tomorrow. At least not where that bolt is. Why does it have to be so blasted cold? Nothing works well. Not us, not the machines. Mr. Dugan, did you say Mr. Anderson would have a rack and team to haul sheaves tomorrow?
Oh, he's got a couple of pretty good teams there, so it'll go quickly. Francis and Mr. Fullerton are going to work the separator, so we'll be fine.
Well, if we're set up by dinner, we should be done before dark.
They didn't waste any time getting the outfit over to Dad's farm. He had the granary over by the East Slough, so they set up there. Having the steam boiler for the first time made the threshing more exciting. It didn't take long for the horses to get used to the machinery. The men divided the labor and the work went quickly. They had enough racks to keep the pitchers on the separator working. The grain went straight to the wagons and over to the Orca. They decided to haul the water from Cooter Creek, about a quarter-mile north. If that slough hadn't been dry, there would never have been a problem. Everything was going too well, I guess. By 10 in the morning, the stack was over 7 feet high. If they'd kept up the pace, they would easily have been done before dark. Betty brought some sandwiches and tea out to the men so they could work right through lunch. About that time, James McLennan called for water. I've heard that water whistle many times. It was a disgrace for the waterman to have the whistle pulled on him. Anyone, for that matter. Everyone was supposed to keep up the pace. And with that big water tanker, there should never have been a problem. Finally, he sent some boys down to the creek with a barrel and decided to shut the outfit down and wait. Most of the workers went behind the granary to get out of the wind. James had been skeptical about the sight glass. Apparently, the water in it wasn't moving. They used to run a lot of slough water through those boilers, and they say that the salts plugged the openings of the valves. They must have waited about 20 minutes, but while they waited for the water, the fire was still hot. Some people say they should have smothered the fire with dirt. Finally, they sighted the water wagon. As it turned out, the water wagon had been stuck in the mud, and they used the second team to pull it out. The men were given the 5-minute signal. It was lucky that there were only a few of them near the boiler. Mr. Fullerton was fiddling with the sight glass, and young Francis Dugan was unloading wood, while James and John McLennan siphoned the water from the tanker into the holding tank of the boiler. The others were at a safer distance, near the granary. The pump and injector were both dry, so there was a moment's delay when James McLennan engaged the pump to fill the boiler. They say you can't run from a boiler explosion. That was it. I guess the water had gotten too low, below the crown sheet. Mr. Fullerton and young Francis were in front of the boiler and were blown to bits. Joe Dugan Jr. was nearer to the separator and had both his legs broken. The McLennan men were behind the boiler, and it severed their legs. It must have been horrible, because they were conscious, and they knew they were going to die. The horses bolted, and right away the men were re-rigging teams and rushing off in all directions for help. Jack Anderson East made it to Saltcoats in 2.5 hours, but was so exhausted when he got there, he could barely tell Dr. Patrick what had happened. The doctors didn't make it in time to save either of the McLennan men. They actually tried to get James McLennan across to Dr. Wright in Russell, but he died in a kitchen of a farmhouse along the way. I think it was the Gordons. Oh, they were too young. I always felt sorry for Betty. She was the only woman around when it happened. The men were busy caring for the wounded, and she had to gather the parts of the two young men together.
Must have been awful.
The explosion changed everybody. My father would never have steam after that. We went together with him and bought a threshing outfit powered by 12 horses. We used it around here for 20 years. It was a lot of work, too, but much safer.
Some of the old folks were sure surprised when Ted brought that new engine home. Never bothered us much because we were too young to remember the explosion. Dad always refused to have one here.
I'm sure he turned in his grave when Ted brought it home. Thank heavens it's going. Would you care for another biscuit, Mr. Hayes?
Oh, yes, please. I'd never realized that 4 young men lost their lives in that explosion.
Oh, yes. It had a terrible toll on the people around here. People were in shock for a long time. Dr. Patrick was really the only one to kick up a fuss. He was angry because the Mounties wouldn't come down and do a proper investigation. He thought there could have been neglect. I don't think an investigation would have made any difference, though. There was no law then.
Most people say the boiler never was inspected after it got to Manitoba.
It may have been inspected in Ontario, but by the time it came here, it was old. The Mounties were the ones who were supposed to do it.
It's important. I've seen equipment get old and run down, and still people insist on using it. At least now we have the statute to try to prevent that.
Oh, yes. It didn't take them long to get to work on that. The government took some criticism for not having a safety law to prevent such accidents. They introduced the safety law only 3 months after it happened. It took some years before they finally passed the law, and I suppose it has helped. You are here. Some lives have been saved because of it, but it can't bring back those young men. I can still see the people in the funeral. Hundreds of people, even women, walked in the funeral procession. They buried Francis and Edward in one grave. They were the first ones buried in the Castleavery Cemetery. It's right on the border of Manitoba and the Territories. Mr. Fullerton's mother sent money from England to build a church there. All of the kids around here went to Sunday school at that little church. But it burned down a few years ago. Everything passes. At least the gravestones won't burn.